So the second loose topic one is one that I know you're ecstatic to go over. We've been waiting to do this.
Yes, overdue.
This is our favorite Sega console. Of course, I'm going to let you, Mr. Sega Man, go first.
So we all know I'm a huge Sega fanboy, not just the Sonic IP, but most of that IP that Sega has, even though they're not doing much with it, which is super annoying, except making dumb jokes on Twitter. But yeah, my favorite Sega console, it was an easy choice for me. It's something that even when we were going to do this topic a few weeks ago, before we took our small break, obviously the Sega Genesis is just, I mean, where do I start? Like, it's always been, you know, when growing up, it was always, to me, at least my group of people where I was raised and stuff like that, it was always like the more mature, cooler Nintendo. You know, even if you looked at the two systems shelf by shelf, you have this gray block, and then you had this sleek, awesome, you know, black system with a little volume knob on it. It just looked futuristic. But it's really the games that on the Genesis that spoke to me. And don't get me wrong, huge love for Sega and everything they did later on, obviously. But that Genesis is something I go back to. I mean, my Genesis is hooked up right now. I'm looking right at it.
Yeah, same.
Beats, you know, everything about that. But even between Sonic being pretty much, you know, the answer to Mario. Always, to me, at the time, I enjoyed those games more than Mario. I understand that's a different situation now. When you're little, you don't know, you know? You're thinking faster, cooler, that's the better game. Obviously, mechanically, Mario is superb. But I like the Sonic games for not having to be Mario. Obviously, you had all these other Rocket, you know, what's the heck's that Rocket game? There's a Rocket Armor or something like that, which is a armadillo or something like that in a suit of armor. Which is way more
the mascot platformer era.
Yeah, Rocket Knight, I think it's called. You know, all these titles like that. But it's also, you know, thanks to the Sega Genesis is what introduced me into, you know, the fighting game community in the original Mortal Kombat trilogy. And let me tell you, when I saw that, and when I saw like what the fatalities looked like on that compared to what they did on the SNES, it was night and day to me. I was like, why would I want that version when this is just superior in every aspect and all things like that. It's just, you know, Sega. I remember getting my Sega Genesis. It was more of a hand-me-down, as always. I'm the middle child, so while my brother got the SNES and the 64 later on, you know, we were always a little bit more behind. I got, like, you know, I remember getting this big blue bin with a Genesis and tons of games thrown in there. But let me tell you, those games I played on there will always hold a place in me because those games are what made I just was having so much fun with those. Like,
yeah.
Besides the Sonic ones, like everything I was playing there, you know, all these other games. Again, like I said, the Mortal Kombat. Right on here, I have, you know, Rage that I was playing. I got X-Men, like all those like licensed games that I used to play on there, the Spider-Man ones and all those other ones, where I was like, I'm seeing the things that I watch on my Saturday morning cartoons. I'm playing them to what I always said looked better than SNES games. Obviously, again, art style is a whole different thing. As a child, I didn't know, but it's you know, just such a good system. It's such a good system in a world where we were having these wars. You know, we had the console war. You really had the SNES and the Genesis battling it out. Obviously, with the famous tagline, "What is it? Genesis or Sega does what Nintendo don't."
Yeah.
Which I think is just amazing marketing. I think this is a perfect way. And I also love that they, you know, the Sega Genesis came out and was starting to flop, and they knew they had to revamp it. They re-released it pretty much, you know, obviously, and giving out Sonic away for free. And they took that hit, and it worked for them. Sega, you know, if I go back to then and think that Sega wouldn't be making consoles right now, it's such a weird concept to that. And
yeah.
I think it really spoke out with the Sega Genesis Mini that came out on the quality of their games and the history of their games. And you have a Sega Genesis Mini, actually, so you know that, I mean, those titles, I mean, I remember when you first opened it, and we just sat there looking at the titles, listening to the music. It's just amazing, and it's just such a flashback. And I do wish we lived in a world where we had Sega being way different than the Sega they are now. And obviously, a lot of those people are gone, passed away, moved on. But that will always be my favorite Sega console. And don't get me wrong, I understand, like, I have a lot of love for even the Game Gear, and I won't mention it because I know that's probably going to be your choice. And I know it's your choice, so we all know which one I'm dancing around. But even now, I just love love that Genesis. There's something about it. There's something about launching. There's something about holding that controller. I have the 6-button control, but I also have the 3-button. But just something about holding it and being like, man, I remember playing this. I remember, it gave me that better experience. I remember seeing my brother play Aladdin on the SNES, and I had Aladdin, and I'm like, oh, I got a sword in my Aladdin. And I thought it was the coolest thing, even though it's ridiculous. And I forgot which one I have. I think I have Lion King on Genesis, but
those platformers on the Genesis.
Those platformers back here, yeah.
Different, man.
Yeah, I have Lion King. Something of the... I think you have the Aladdin. But even playing Lion King on the Genesis, man, I just thought it was always like the better system. I also got to give it to them. Just look at their casing. Nice big black boxes and detailing everything.
Plastic, man.
Yeah,
Age is so much better. Yeah. The Super Nintendo boxes are annoying to get your hands on.
Yeah, it's impossible because, if the room was too moist, the box would get,
Done.
If it was a hot, humid day, your case was getting destroyed. But, yeah, so that's my system, Genesis. Me and Genesis are always, as soon, my Genesis broke actually a few months ago, and I had to go get a new Genesis, which wasn't too hard. Look, there's a seller online.
Yeah, they're relatively inexpensive.
Yeah, he sold me the whole bundle pretty cheaply, so I was super excited for that. So that's me. I'm the Sega Genesis fanboy. I'm going to ask you, even though I know the answer, what is your favorite Sega console?
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, Sega's so tricky because it's like a lot of people act like they have two consoles when they don't. They have multiple ones. They just a lot of misfires. Some didn't come to the United States. There's obviously it's like the SG-1000 or something which is like their first one. There's the Master System, which is their equivalent to the NES. That I couldn't choose the Master System because there is absolutely some hits on there, but they're few and far between. It's not touching the NES. Then we have the Genesis, which is the obvious go-to. But I had to just look game to game, and to be honest, my favorite Sega games of all time are not on the Genesis, which I know sounds like it's insane, but it's obviously, for me, the Dreamcast. Now, and I do have to give a shout out to the Saturn too, and obviously there's great stuff on like the 32X and stuff like that, but those are extensions, those don't count. And the Saturn is everything what's wrong with Sega to a T. Like I don't know what was going on there. They were going through it, but yeah, the Dreamcast. Now, before I get started, I wanted to compile a quick list just off the top of my head. So I was writing them down right before we did the podcast. And I should have went on Google to check it out. But just off the top of my head, I wanted to think of some of the awesome Dreamcast games I like. Because a lot of people say the Dreamcast is a great machine but doesn't have games. I'm just going to list off some of the games that I could think of off the top of my head. So there's Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. You had Skies of Arcadia, Power Stone, Shenmue, Phantasy Star Online, Code Veronica, Soul Calibur, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Crazy Taxi, Ikaruga, Space Channel 5, Jet Set Radio, and did I say Skies of Arcadia already?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. There you go. So I never want to hear nobody say that there's no Dreamcast games again. Show me another console with a lineup like that. Come on, man. Come on. Like those are real good games. So good that a lot of them had to get ported to other games. So they're like, no, you guys got to play this game. Exactly. So no, and you have to keep in mind, like when this console launched, like the power that this thing was outputting was like insanity. And to this day, like in terms of upscaling consoles, it does the best of any game console from that generation. The way the way it was incorporating like memory cards and high resolution textures and a web browser and stuff like that. I mean, this is just a legendary console with some really awesome games, and I feel like the kind of downfall of the Dreamcast is less the Dreamcast fault and more so where Sega was as a company at that time. And unfortunately, it was I feel like it suffered a little bit from like a Wii U problem where it wasn't so much that there wasn't good games, but they made a lot of bad choices for what they needed to be able to do to compete at that time. And with the PS2 on the horizon, and Microsoft jumping in, and Nintendo obviously coming off the 64, which was a rough patch for them, but right there with the GameCube, they were in a point where they needed to come, and they need to come hard. And it was almost like damn near impossible for them to ever be able to compete with these juggernauts in the way they were. Again, like PlayStation were, I feel like Sega stumbled, and in their stumbling, they allowed PlayStation to just come right in and dominate and take their spot in many ways. So suddenly, people weren't talking about Sega versus Nintendo anymore. They were talking about Nintendo versus PlayStation. And that stumble, that's all it takes, is a couple too many extensions for the Genesis and launching a disc-based console a little too fast that by the time the Dreamcast came, it was too late. There was nothing really they could do to make it work. And everything you'd want from a console, which is a strong piece of hardware, good first-party games, and great third-party games, were all there. But the company itself were not in the financial position to be able to double and triple down to make it work. So basically, they had to give up, and they had to start porting their stuff to Nintendo, their biggest competitor at one point, and kind of just get out of the console space and just be a publisher. So again, a lot of the critiques that the Dreamcast get, again, I look at as more of a Sega problem and less of a Dreamcast problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I had to choose a second one, obviously Dreamcast is where I would go.
Yeah.
Because, I still remember them doing things, obviously, prior PS2 coming out and Xbox being what it ended up being. I remember going to a friend's house and he was playing, I don't remember specifically which one, but he was playing a sports game online on his Dreamcast. And I'm like, what do you mean? And I remember him, he's like, oh, but look at this. And he launched the web browser and
That's insane.
I'm like, you can go on the internet without having to sit in front of a computer, and it was just it was so trippy, and I'm like, this is the future. Even when you look at that control, now it's not the best to hold, but at the time when you saw that control, it looked futuristic. It looked something straight out of Back to the Future 2, where it was like, what is this? And it looked so cool and it was so amazing. And I also am a big standby where people say, oh, it had no games. That's a terrible lie, because, Dead or Alive 2 was on there, all these, and the whole list.
You heard my list.
Yeah, you heard that list. Not even just the Sega ones and things like that. It had good games. You had RPGs, you had sports games that played better. You had everything. Shoot 'em ups.
Some of the best of all time, including Ikaruga.
Yeah. So it's like, it was there, and it just wasn't in the cards for Sega to plan it right, release it right, and all that stuff, which did unfortunately cause its downfall.
And I know a lot of people throw around the term like ahead of its time a lot, but I think there's no better example than the Dreamcast, not only on a technical level of what the console was able to do and output, but the fact that if you look at some of the franchises that were on this console, a lot of them persist online, which is to this day.
Yeah.
Which is not something you could say for a lot of consoles of this generation. So, like, I know a lot of people have their jokes about Sonic Adventure, but the 3D Sonic games this is their first foray into what it ultimately turned out into. So all the awesome PS2 and PS3 ones that some people like, some people don't, this laid the framework for that. Mm-hmm. Not to mention Power Stone in terms of third-person action games. I'm not going to go as far to say, obviously, like Power Stone led to Smash Brothers, because Smash Brothers existed. I know that. But in terms of a lot of the quality of life changes that came out after the fact, I think Power Stone did lend itself to a little bit of that in the Melee world, and then onto Brawl. Phantasy Star Online. Yep. You go on Xbox now. Now that's still a thing. Set up on Dreamcast. Code Veronica, one of the most in-demand Resident Evil games to get re-released or gone back to at some capacity for Capcom. Started on Dreamcast. Soul Calibur, still an active franchise to this day.
Yep.
Marvel vs. Capcom. Yeah, okay, the last one was a little botched, but that franchise, come on now.
But even then, yeah, MVC2 is still held up as like one of the best fighting games ever. I disagree with that, but it's up there.
And obviously, without Jet Set Radio, I don't care what nobody says, you do not get Splatoon. Period.
Nope.
So, again, in terms of influence, few consoles have ever had the influence that Dreamcast had. And it was like one of those music artists that was like super dope in their time, passed away young, influenced a whole bunch of artists, and a lot of people did not give them credit when they were still alive, but in retrospect we look back at them and it's like, man, they were really changing the game, weren't they? And that's kind of how I look at the Dreamcast. It's like the console that passed away too young, that influenced everybody, and in their day, everybody had jokes for them. But then fast forward, when you look at the industry and you saw how much that affected, to this day, like I honestly could say, and I know this is going to be a hot take, that in many ways, the Dreamcast has a bigger influence into where the game industry is now than even the PS2 or GameCube, in my opinion.
Yes,
that's just
absolutely.
Influence. I'm just talking influence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can co-sign that, absolutely. Again, they launched because they stepped on the shoulders of the Dreamcast, is how I like to see it.
I mean, the GameCube. I mean, so much of the GameCube's third-party opportunities came off of the failure of the Dreamcast.
Yep, correct. That's absolutely true.
Just like in many ways, what allowed the Switch to be so successful was allowing not only awesome Switch games, but access to a whole bunch of great Wii U games. Those ports of the Dreamcast games going onto the GameCube, Sonic Heroes coming off the back of the Sonic Adventure ports, that's what allowed for that. That Sonic fan base to jump ship onto the GameCube allowed for these amazing and some of my favorite GameCube games ever. And now obviously that Nintendo Sega heritage they're built in one with another. It's very common now to see that. But at the time, I mean, they allowed for that GameCube launch to be as successful as it was because Sega was right there with them, feeding them a lot of Sega's best games.
Yeah.